Good evening, my name is Paul Halferty, and I am the Director for the Centre of Canadian Studies here at UCD. And on behalf of my co-organizer of this event, the Craig Dobbin Chair in Canadian Studies, Professor Jane URQUHART, I'd like to welcome you all to Imagining Home, a literary celebration of the connections between Canada and Ireland without snow. So Imagining Home has been made possible by the work and generosity of a great number of people and organizations. First, I would like to thank our participating authors for making Imagining Home the amazingly exciting event that it is. I would also like to thank our partners, the Ireland-Canada University Foundation and James Kelly, its director, the Embassy of Canada for Ireland and Ambassador Vickers, and our co-producers in the event, the UCD College of Arts and Humanities, and Sarah Prescott and Emer Beasley, and University Relations, Ailish O'Brien and Mary Staunton. Special mention should also be made for the Boris Festival of Writing and Ideas and Vivian Guinness, as both Margaret Atwood and Enright will be speaking at that festival, which takes place this weekend at Boris House in County Carlow, so on June 8th and 10th. UCD is Ireland's global university, and Imagining Home is one of the many exciting examples of the truly international character of our university. UCD's international connections are various, but one of these, which is being celebrated tonight, is the connection between Canada and Ireland, especially its literary connections, the stories that link our two countries. Of course, our greatest connection is found in the literally hundreds of thousands of Irish people who have made their home in Canada, as well as Canadians who make their home here. And the strong connections that they foster have fostered over the years. One example is the story of the late Dr. Craig Dobbin, whose forebears left County Waterford and settled in Newfoundland. Dr. Dobbin was very proud of his Irish roots, which he acknowledged through a number of philanthropic activities, including the establishment of the Ireland-Canada University Foundation, and of course, the Craig Dobbin the Craig Dobbin Visiting Professorship at UCD, which Jane URQUHART has this year. Both of which were organized through Professor John Kelly when he was registrar here at UCD. Since then, the Craig Dobbin Professorship has been held by a great number of Canadian researchers, and the Ireland-Canada University Foundation continues to foster research in Canada and Ireland by bringing Canadian scholars to Ireland and Irish scholars to Canada. This August, the Ireland-Canada University Foundation will host the D'Arcy McGee International Forum in Carlingford on the 15th to the 17th of August. So these are just a few of the examples of the strong links that exist between Ireland and Canada, and indeed the tremendous legacy of Dr. Craig Dobbin. And it is now with my pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Prescott, Principal of the UCD College of Arts and Humanities.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you very much to Paul for all his work organising. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to UCD. It's my pleasure to add a few words about the college before introducing Jane URQUHART. The College of Arts and Humanities at UCD is committed to providing a world-class learning environment for undergraduate and graduate students from a wide diversity of backgrounds and experience, attracting students from all over the world. So it's very fitting that we are celebrating our Canadian connections tonight. This commitment to diversity is shown by our cutting-edge research and academic programmes, including, again, appropriately and fittingly, a new BA Humanities, which takes its first students in September and also introduces its first undergraduate students in the subject of creative writing for the first time at UCD. This new four-year BA actively encourages students to engage in interdisciplinary work, that is, study which considers the ways in which different subjects connect and inform each other. The Centre for Canadian Studies and the Craig Dobbin Chair in Canadian Studies exemplify the college's commitment to this interdisciplinary learning, and Imagining Home allows us to shine a light on the exciting and very rich literary connections between Canada and Ireland in particular. The The college is delighted and honoured to welcome such internationally lauded and critically acclaimed authors to UCD, but I also want to welcome everyone here and to bring the broader community closer to the exciting ideas that are every day both imagined and at home in UCD. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Jane Urquhart, this year's Craig Dobbin Chair, and appropriately again, I think, the first creative writer to hold the position. And as this evening proves, I think, Jane has been a transformational presence during her year at UCD, for which we want to thank her very much, and her contributions to the School of English, Drama and Film, the College of Arts and Humanities, and of course, UCD as a whole. Jane is the author of 8 internationally acclaimed and award-winning novels, a collection of short fiction, and 4 books of poetry. She's also written a biography of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and she was editor of the excellent Penguin Book of Canadian Short Stories. She's officer of the Order of Canada, and of course, again, this year's UCD Craig Dobbin Chair in Canadian Studies. And Jane will be introducing this evening's speakers. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That is lovely, lovely, lovely. And I'm really delighted to be here, as you know. I'd love to thank you and everyone in the UCD community for making me feel so welcome. All over the university, I feel welcome, of course, but in particular in the College of Arts and Humanities, and because that's the place where I played my very small part, but a really important part, especially for me. I cannot tell you what a thrill it was to be able to spend a year in an environment where writers and thinkers are encouraged and celebrated. Almost every day, there was a talk or a reading that I was eager to attend, or the announcement of another fascinating publication that I was eager to read. And discussions with faculty in the common room or with students during the office hours fully enriched my life and energized me. I am sure that I am 10 years younger now than I was when I arrived, and my thinking has become more complex and I hope more humane and open to varying points of view. I'm in my 60s now, and more than ever, I realize the true value not only of an early education in the arts and humanities, but an ongoing education in arts and humanities. None of this would have been possible, of course, without the Ireland-Canada University Foundation and the Craig Dobbin Chair, which sponsored my tenure, and that of other Craig Dobbin Chairs over the period of the past 15 years. They are also responsible for helping to fund this exciting evening devoted to exploring the connection between Irish and Canadian literary experiences, during which Irish authors John Banville and Anne Enright and Canadian author Margaret Atwood will all speak. It would take all evening for me to thank the many, many people I need to thank and to whom I am enormously grateful for their help on this project. But I must single out the 3 essential people of what came to be known as the Imagining Home team. Paul Halferty, who is the co-creator of this event and who you have already met, and Emer Beasley of the College of Arts and Humanities, and Mary Staunton from the President's Office. I now believe that every author who has appeared in public events should be forced to participate in the planning of at least one of these events in their lifetime in order to fully grasp the enormous amount of hard work that goes into making them happen. This hard work was made so much easier by the 3 people I have just named and by countless others university-wide. I am so grateful. Tonight, we are hoping to explore the role of the imagination and memory, and the role that both of these items have played in Canada and in Ireland, particularly in the world of letters. With this in mind, I would like to invite Anne Enright to the stage. Anne, of course, is the distinguished Booker Prize-winning author of such celebrated books as The Gathering, The Last Waltz, and The Green Road. And the wonderful news is that she will be joining the faculty of the Creative Writing Department here at UCD this fall. The 2017 Ireland Fiction Laureate, she is known to readers all over the world and is much loved by her Canadian readers. A little known fact about Anne Enright is that she spent 1 year in Canada as a teenager. Please welcome Anne Enright.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you. I'm not in UCD yet. I'm a figment of UCD future, a ghost of UCD future. Very much looking forward to it. This isn't really a talk or a lecture, it's just a few thoughts about connections, unconnected thoughts about connections. I went to Canada in 1979 for 2 years with some lovely Canadian funding for a scholarship in a place called the Lester B. Pearson College of the Pacific. It's an international school outside Victoria on Vancouver Island, set in the trees and forests there. In my first English class there, the teacher, who's called Theo, handed out a sheet with 3 poems to discuss. The first was a kind of winsome, tough little poem by E.E. Cummings called My Sweet Old Etc. My sweet old etc. Aunt Lucy, during the last war, could, and what's more, did tell you what everyone was fighting for. The second was a poem I already knew by Keats, La Belle Dame sans merci, which is about death, more or less, in the form of a beautiful woman, which is not, I suspect, the way that death will come to me. It contains the line, she looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. Well, said Theo, we all know what that means. Well, I thought, we certainly didn't. Not until you pointed it out, and after class, I took him to task for turning this wonderful, beautiful, high and sacred object by Keats, dragging it through the muck. I was really angry. I accused him, basically, of having a dirty mind. I was 16. Theo Dombrowski was then 36. He grew up in Port Alberni, a logging town on Vancouver Island, which is pervaded by the stink of the sawmill, or was in those days, not unlike the high note you got in the Liffey back in the days of the Clondalkin paper mills. In this small town, Theo fell in love with his wife, Eileen, learned to play that fine Polish instrument, the box accordion, taught himself piano, listened to opera, tried his hand as an artist, and got himself all the way to the University of British Columbia, where he wrote a doctoral thesis on Ulysses by James Joyce. Not many Joyceans jogged in 1979, but Theo did jog. He also swam, lumberjacked, and taught Ukrainian dancing. Theo could do anything, including the rude bits of Keats. He loved a good fight. There was a major Barney over the Tundish scene in The Portrait of the Artist as a young man. It got a bit physical. Cushions were thrown. I was too busy quivering with outraged disbelief in that first class to listen to the third poem, though a line of it stayed with me for many years after. Each time I hit a key on my electric typewriter, speaking of peaceful trees, another village explodes. I got an electric typewriter when I turned 21 as a present from my family. This was long before the pattering hush of the electronic keyboard. Electric typewriters are really fierce objects. They're very mechanical. They're the Gatling gun of the typing life. And these remembered lines became set in the rhythms of my typing and also in my terror of the blank page each time I hit a key on my electric typewriter. Another village explodes. Because, of course, I had lost the peaceful trees from the quotation over time. A few years ago, I chased the reference in one of my letters to Theo, and he sent it to me again. Chosen for the class, he said, because of its wonderful, sinister nervousness. It was called "It is Dangerous to Read Newspapers," and it was by Margaret Atwood. In the poem, she's beset by images of violence, war, and mass slaughter. It's hard to tell if the poet's anxiety is for herself or for the victims. I am the cause, she says, although she is not the cause or barely the cause of a world in which corpses are bulldozed into pits. It's Dangerous to Read Newspapers owes something to the flayed sensibility of Plath, and it's stalled in the same kind of murderous passivity as My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun by Emily Dickinson. But the poem is also a challenge to the writer's neurotic distance from the world, how we thrive on pain, even the pain of others, without doing anything to fix it. Atwood is Theo's favorite writer, or as he tactfully came to say after I started to publish, his other favorite writer. Later that year, Theo gave me her second novel, Surfacing, to read, in which a woman loses herself, both literally and metaphorically, in the forests of northern Quebec. Maybe he was just trying to get me out of the house. I was 17 and spent a lot of time smoking and having large thoughts about myself. Surfacing seemed to be a guide to having your nervous breakdown out in the fresh air, of which there is no shortage in Canada. The school I was in was always dragging you out into it. I'd find myself stumbling along some or other trail to find cougar tracks across an empty beach, eat mussels as long as your hand picked fresh from the rocks. At the end of the first of these hikes, still jet-lagged, after ospreys and cormorants, no orcas, but maybe a sea otter, unless it was a seal. No, it was 2 sea otters there in the kelp. After all of this, I staggered into a camping ground to find the driftwood already stacked, with the bags of marshmallows heaped, the chord sequence of 4 strong winds printed out on probably laminated cards, and a line of portaloos standing guard in a clearing. And behind the portaloos were hundreds of whispering miles of old-growth forest. And what did it whisper? Enjoy your marshmallows. My goodness, they look good. If you've ever been on the west coast of British Columbia, you will remember the height of the Douglas fir, the cool grey of the Sitka spruce, and the way this relentless verticality is broken by the arbutus, a broadleaf evergreen with easy curving branches and a red outer bark that flakes over an inner bark that is cool, smooth, and almost green. It's a little like our own Kerry strawberry tree, a little like the tree they call in Latin America the gringo tree, because it peels red, just like a white man's skin. This arbutus is the most touchable, the most climbable tree you could imagine. And though I've seen the scrubby Irish version as far away as Australia, the magnificent Arbutus menziesii does not travel much or well. It's hard to propagate because, according to Theo, before it germinates, the seed has to pass through the digestive tract of a particular bird. I think there are 2 specimens in Ireland, and they're both lonely. One of them is outside the canteen in RTE, just a mile down the road, a relic of botanical tourism undertaken in the late 19th century by the owners of Montrose House. Although when I was in Canada, I stayed indoors smoking and talking while heartier students rescued beached whales and scaled mountains, I did, quietly and out of the corner of my eye, really love that tree. In my mid-20s, I worked as a producer in RTE television, and I left one or other meeting with management in Montrose House to walk over to the canteen looking for a cup of coffee or a place to cry. And the tree was there for me as a clear and growing representation of other realities, languages, and possibilities. At Christmas, the first year I was in Canada, we went to Winnipeg for deep cold, staying with a student's family in a kind of gingerbread house, a thing with wooden eaves and shutters and triple glazing. There was more food, more baking, more cinnamon and eggnog than I thought possible. It was a non-stop round of kindness, ease, bounty, cross-country skiing, patterned socks, and positivity. I am still, slightly suspicious of positivity, which means I'm always a stranger in some parts of Canada. Another Christmas was spent in a cabin with 3 other students on Galliano Island in the Juan de Fuca Strait, my first sight of a forest landscape after fire, when we hiked in darkness over the spine of the island to fill our rucksacks with oysters, which we ate for 3 or 4 days after. I don't know why it was dark. Perhaps being teenagers, we just forgot to get up during the day. My recollection of those years is also the recollection of enormous, wonderful, epic sleeping I did in one place or another. After Galliano, I went up to Powell River to stay with another student, a member of the Tla'amin First Nation, whose family let me sleep undisturbed by eggnog or cinnamon buns or hay rides or fun. That was the week it snowed in BC. And if you think Ireland panics in the snow, then my goodness, you should chase yourself some weather down the western edge of Canada, where no one has snow tires and cars slew into each other on the forest roads, not because the surface is slippy, but because the drivers are just gone hysterical. At the end of the 2 years, I hitchhiked from Victoria to Calgary with 2 female friends up over the Rockies to get our fill of bears, brown bears at the town dumpsters and on a ridge. On the day we crossed the Continental Divide, the standing shape of a grizzly, or is that my organizing brain to put a bear that's known for the ridge on his neck in the place where the planet gathers itself up into a ridge that runs the length of North America? I don't know, but I do remember the bear as we stuck our thumbs out for a lift from one of our other crazy guy in a pickup truck. The guys in the pickups were, without a single exception, crazy. And they kept us safe. For reading material on that trip, I brought this book, which is The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood. And this is the first time, I think, that I'd read a book which contained ideas about being a woman that I might find useful. It doesn't seem like a lot to ask. That a novel should give you something to think about, that it might bring you that bit further on. Bringing us all a bit further on is a habit of Atwood's, though sometimes we have to double back in order to find it, as the world recently discovered revisiting The Handmaid's Tale. Though I have to say it made sense to me the first time round, which was in 1985. This was the year my reading caught up with Atwood's writing, and I realized that there would be future books if I knew how to wait for them. Meanwhile, back in 1981, The Edible Woman was the thing I brought home from Canada. It went into my luggage for the flight home, another epic sleeping event, which involved an engine failing or actually dropping off, although that doesn't seem possible, and me waking up on the tarmac expecting Amsterdam and finding Edmonton. Because I was there so young, Canada still seems to be a place separated from my adult life, both by geography and by time. It's really hard for me to make connections. I didn't think it was possible, for example, that the writer S.E. Edugyan could live in Colwood, which is the local pharmacy where we used to go to buy shampoo. How could a writer live in Colwood, of all places? Returning to Victoria for a writers' festival, someone pointed out Carol Shields' house. I go to a party at the bookseller Jack Monroe's, and I really don't believe this can be real. I read his ex-wife Alice Munro's work in order to be reminded of Canada, and now here I am somehow impossibly back in those books, or in Alice Munro's life before she wrote them, or in my own life before I read them, though I lived just down the road. Another time in Toronto, crossing the Bloor Street Viaduct, the site of Ondaatje's first chapter in The Skin of a Lion, a place more important to me than Niagara is down the road, banging on the window of the minivan, the way Theo Dombrowski from Port Alberni might give an involuntary yelp at the sight of the James Joyce Tower. People have a thing about Ireland. They put all kinds of significance into the place. Canada does something similar for me. Maybe instead of resisting it, we should give in to the landscape's ability to make things matter for those who pass through. In Newfoundland, I talked to Lisa Moore on a ferry that sails from Farewell to Fogo. And I don't know if it's the writer or her work or the remoteness of the spot. Perhaps it is those peaceful trees. But I realize that a mood of many years is lifting just there. It is time to go home and do some typing.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was fantastic. And forgive me for saying 1 year when, in fact, it was two. Twice as long in Canada. The ability to imagine another place and another possibility is central to both the act of migration from one kind of life to another and the creative act of making a work of fiction where alternative worlds are built in the mind. And what could be more intriguing in this regard than a literary love affair? The relationship between the celebrated Irish author Elizabeth Bowen and Canadian diplomat and diarist Charles Ritchie, which lasted for 30 years from the 1940s to the 1970s, had many different sides to it, but the strongest, I think, was their ability, or perhaps their need due to the fact that their meetings were infrequent, to imagine the geography of the other's world. The love letters that Elizabeth Bowen wrote to Charles Ritchie were collected and edited by Victoria Glendinning, who had agreed to come to UCD to speak about them during our March 1st version of Imagining Home. What none of us had imagined was the amount of Canadian weather we somehow conjured in Ireland on that date, thereby ensuring, by the way, that children all over Dublin would fully appreciate a Canadian child's winter, and providing Dubliners of all ages with that very Canadian experience, cancellation due to inclement weather. Victoria was sadly unable to join us for this, our June 6th date, due to a previous engagement, but has given me permission to pretend to be her, and this is a daunting challenge, believe me, in a conversation with our next guest. Also daunting. John Banville's latest books are the novel, Mrs. Osmond, and Timepieces, a Dublin memoir. Among the awards he has received are the Man Booker Prize, the Austrian State Prize for Literature, the Kafka Prize, and the Prince of Asturias Award. Please welcome John Banville.
I hope to meet afterwards that girl who screamed.
I was going to say, you have a very serious fan in the audience there. Okay, we should begin by a brief biographical background for our most interesting lovers. Perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about Elizabeth Bowen.
Well, the first thing to say, which I always say, is that if Elizabeth Bowen had been a man, she would be regarded now as one of the great writers of the 20th century. Probably if she'd been taken more seriously she would have been an even greater writer. I do think, one needs encouragement. She was born in 1899 in Herbert Place in Dublin, from which I noticed, by the way, that there's a blue plaque to her on that building. It's been taken away. I wonder why, because lots of people in Ireland disapprove of Elizabeth Bowen. She was born in 1899. She always used to say that she was as old as a century. I assume that as the century got older, she said that fewer and fewer times. She was wholly admirable. There's a wonderful anecdote of her serving cocktails to her friends on the balcony of her flat in Clarence Terrace in London during the Blitz, and apologizing for all the noise. Such elegance and such self-possession. She had a good life, but a melancholy one. Charles Ritchie was the love of her life. He was, like all men who are the love of some woman's life, he wasn't quite worthy of her. He was a very elegant, very poised, not particularly a handsome man. He had just extraordinarily long head. I mean, it was about so long.
She had kind of a long head too, though, don't you think?
Well, they said about all Elizabeth's lovers, and she had quite a few. I mean, she was quite a gore, Elizabeth, in her time. They all said about her that she had the most beautiful back that they'd ever seen, which is a wonderful compliment. I mean, whoever looks at it,
didn't Charles say
that,
that she reminded him of Donatello's David,
yeah.
Which I always found intriguing in a way.
Makes you wonder about Charles a bit.
Exactly, yes. Well, he was, I knew Charles Ritchie, and I got to know him quite well in his later years. He was an enormously elegant man, and also hilariously funny. I mean, just the most wonderful and sophisticated sense of humor. I suspect that that would have been very evident to Elizabeth, though the letters seem to me to be kind of infused with this sort of melancholy and this kind of desire to, a desire for great self-exposure, which seems at odds with what we have come to know about Elizabeth Bowen and her restraint as a person, perhaps not so much as a writer.
Yes, well, you see, in those days people wrote letters. They don't anymore, they tweet. Or Twitter, or whatever it's called.
Yes, can you imagine Elizabeth Bowen on Twitter? No, somehow not so much. Well, she might have been great.
One always has to distrust a writer's letters because they always have an eye on posterity. We always have an eye on posterity.
Well, those letters almost got lost because...
no, but you didn't know that when she was writing them.
Yes, that's true.
I don't mean to in any way to criticize them. They are beautiful letters. They are beautiful pieces of literature.
Well, they're beautifully written, and one does have the notion that she's watching herself write them a little bit.
Of course. Yeah. All writers watch themselves. If they're sending a check, writing a begging letter, they're watching what the hand is doing. But she did, obviously, she did treasure him. And he treasured her in his way. He was a bit of a rake, I think, in his diplomatic way. Lots of lovers. And in the midst of their affair, he got married to a woman.
His second cousin.
Glorying in the name of Sylvia Smellie. I suppose if your name is Smellie, you'd marry practically anybody.
Well, she was already married when they began to know each other, so, and then her husband died shortly after Charles married. But the intriguing fact of that marriage is that, it speaks to things about women that really, hopefully, will be in the past very soon. Charles felt that he needed a, quote, chatelaine because he was going to be an ambassador. Now, that's not to say that the relationship between Charles and Sylvia was not a very strong and very affectionate one, but he remained connected to Elizabeth Bowen, romantically connected and connected as a friend until the time of Bowen's death. And in fact, Charles was at her deathbed, as you likely know, with bottles of
With
champagne.
bottles of champagne, yes.
Which I think is really kind of stunning in a way. They drank a lot together and alone.
Well, everybody drank in those days. Everybody smoked. Everybody, well, sort of stopped at that.
They constantly smoked.
She did love him. He was a sustenance to her. He was a support to her. He was a literary inspiration for her. She dedicated the heat of the day to him, which I don't know that I would like to have the heat of the day dedicated to me. But it must have been like, I'm always uncomfortable in talking about love because especially of this kind, because I was glancing through the book today, and if those of you who haven't recommended it, Victoria Glendinnings's book, Love's Civil War, which is the letters of Elizabeth Bowen to Charles Ritchie. It's a beautiful book, it's a beautiful thing. I would encourage you to become acquainted with it. But it did strike me. I remembered Marilyn Monroe's wonderful line from Some Like It Hot, and she said, "I always get the fuzzy end of the lollipop." I think it struck me with renewed force how in those days women got the fuzzy end of the lollipop. Charles Ritchie could swan about the world. He could decide that he needed a chatelaine. He could, get married. And there's a heartbreaking line in Elizabeth Bowen recording to herself. She says, "He's getting married. I had to agree. And last evening he said, all is well, tout est bien." And she said, "It almost broke me." And I felt such sorrow for her. But again, the literary note was struck.
Yes, and also there was always that kind of longing that was then put in place that I think may have fed her creativity to a certain extent. The whole sense of imagining another landscape, in a sense. She talks about Ottawa as if she did eventually visit Ottawa, but when Charles first moved back to Ottawa, she talks about it as if she were there, which I think is kind of stunning, and also as if he were a constant presence at Bowen's Court, which of course was Elizabeth Bowen's marvelous house in County Cork, which had been part of her family for several hundred years. And although Charles did visit Bowen's Court, he was never there for a long period of time, and yet she named Bowen's Court to him as, quotes, their house. In other words, because he had stayed there for even a couple of days, suddenly the house had been transformed by his presence, or perhaps by the idea of his presence, which is something that I think really fed those letters.
Oh, yes, you could say that all writers invent people and places in the way that Joyce invented Dublin. He couldn't come back here because, he would have to disassemble his invention. I think that to a certain extent, Elizabeth Bowen invented Charles Ritchie, but then we all invent each other. We all invent the love object.
We do. And I think that one of the most intriguing things was that she also invented Canada to a certain extent. One has to remember that their relationship began during that intense period of the Blitz, as you mentioned, which was apologizing for the noise. That's the other thing that you see in Elizabeth Bowen and in Charles Ritchie, actually, is this sort of adherence to good behavior, regardless of what is going on. In other words, everyone is still polite. But the time was so intense and so fraught that they were kind of flung together in this. I remember one line said, "Oh, we had the most marvelous day." This is from a diary of Charles Ritchie's, sitting outside, sipping, I believe it was some kind of cocktail, perhaps, martinis, and watching, and then later on in the evening, watching the searchlights. Just think what was going on. But this is the paragraph that really that made me realize that she was starting to invent Canada as well as her own geography. She says, County Cork is, now that the war is over, County Cork is waking up from its long summer sleep. Houses that were empty are opened, and men just out of the army are rushing about doing things about their horses. It's like scenes out of War and Peace. They really might be coming back after the Napoleonic Wars. Pretty women in 1938 evening dresses sitting around them in groups in lamplit drawing rooms, hanging on their words. I'm sure it's being like that in your country, too. And of course, that does not describe Canada in any way, but I love the kind of imposition of the landscape of Anglo-Irish Cork on the Canadian sensibility. So it's a fascinating thing what this kind of, I suppose, unrequitedness brings about in the fictional mind of Elizabeth Bowen and Charles Ritchie, to a certain extent, although he was much more ambivalent and much more likely to distance himself in some way or another from the relationship.
Oh yes, die ferne Geliebte, the distant beloved, is always more vivid and more precious than the one that's snoring beside you in bed.
Well, yes, of course. And that was another thing I wondered about. Do you think they shared a bed in Bowen's court, or would he have had his own room?
Well, he would have had his own room because the servants would have objected. They wouldn't have objected, they would have known.
They would have known.
The servants wouldn't have
but
been allowed to.
Known
Of course
anyway?
they knew anyway. But there had to be...
There had to be some sort of pretense of something.
There had to be a pretense of decorum.
Or how about those moments when the postman arrives, or with a huge parcel from the Canadian High Commission, and in the parcel is 4 bottles of rye whiskey.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
So, what would you think would be likely in terms of Charles's state of mind? Do you think that he was projecting his own desire to be a writer onto the sort of accomplishments of Elizabeth Bowen? Would that have possibly been a connection between them?
I think that might be to give him a little too much weight and seriousness. He was a diplomat. He was a very good diplomat. I mean, a very distinguished career. But he was not an imaginative artist. I don't think he could have been. The diaries are interesting, very interesting. But to imagine a world as Elizabeth does in that description, I mean, she's not reporting what she's seen. She's reporting what she imagined.
And what has sort of taken place in her visual imagination.
When I say imagined, I don't mean that it didn't take place. She imagined it into being. You know, the world is incoherent, it's inchoate. It hasn't been made until we imagine it. And that's what she's doing in that paragraph. I don't think Charles Ritchie would have been able to do that. And if he'd tried, he would have embarrassed himself, and he would certainly have embarrassed Elizabeth Bowen. Again, I'm not being critical.
No,
Simply talking about different kinds of people.
Charles was very drawn to a diplomatic life. He was interested in power structures and in engagement. He wouldn't have been able, I don't think, to achieve the kind of withdrawal and seclusion that would have been necessary for a life of a writer, certainly of Elizabeth Bowen's stature and accomplishment.
But you see, I don't think that we're talking about her now, her stature and accomplishment, but she was seen as quite a good writer, and she had a couple of bestsellers, and she was seen as essentially, a woman writer. But if you read The Last September, which is, I think, her first novel, published when she was 29, which means it was written when she was 26, 27, it's an extraordinary accomplishment. The hand of Henry James lies a little too heavily upon it, perhaps, but the hand of Henry James lies a little too heavily upon all of us. But it is an extraordinary accomplishment for a young woman in that time, in that place, to produce this exquisite work of art. I don't think she ever did anything as well again, because she became, maybe it was because she went away, she went to England. She always said, you know, that her ideal place was, that her real home was halfway between, somewhere in the Irish Sea, halfway between England and Ireland. And I think that's true. There is something essentially Irish and essentially Anglo-Irish about the last September, which makes it, I think, unique in her work.
And you adapted The Last September for film, did you not, for a Neil Jordan film?
Probably made a travesty of it.
What was it like entering that world and taking that particular landscape, the Cork landscape? Did you visit Bones Court in order to, and was it still there?
There's no Bones Court. No, I mean, Bones Court was gone in 1960.
Right.
A local garage owner bought it and tore it down. No, I didn't. Look, I don't know about you. I don't go and look at places that I'm going to write about. There's a wonderful story anecdote told of W.H. Auden. He's going with his friends on a train through the Alps, and of course he's reading. And they say to him, "Whiston, look at the view." And he says, "Yes, I've seen it now." And he's back to his book. We take tiny bits of the world, which is what she does. Bones Court and Seven Winters, beautiful book. But again, a work of the imagination.
Yes.
You mustn't confuse a writer's memoirs or travelogues or anything factual with fact. The writer, what the imaginative writer does is imagine the world into existence. And that process, it doesn't transfigure the world. It brings the world into focus. It makes the world, the so-called ordinary. It shows the so-called ordinary to be as extraordinary as it is. And she was marvelous at doing that. But I think that she fell in love with, apart from Ritchie, Charles Ritchie, who was good for her, she fell in love with the most awful people. You know, some truly dreadful men. And she wrote about them very well in her books.
That's what men are for.
That's what we're here for, to be written about well.
That's right.
As the cads that we are.
That's it.
The cads and bounders.
Well, I'm going to say now that having brought up Last September, I'm now going to ask you to stay here while I introduce the next couple of guests, and we're hoping that you and they will discuss adaptation and how that takes place between a novel and a screenplay or a play or indeed libretto or some other form. So you can stay here and I will introduce the next two people. Thank you, John. So, as I said, following on the heels of this, we're going to continue with our discussion of adaptation as it has manifested itself in certain Canadian novels, and as it happened here in Ireland. I would ask John to remain in place, which I have done, and introduce two more participants. Unfortunately, Frank McGuinness is unable to join us this evening. In his place, we have Professor Paul Perry. Paul is the author of 5 acclaimed works of poetry and 4 best-selling co-authored Karen Perry novels, some of which have been optioned for film. A winner of the Hennessy Prize for Irish Literature and the recipient of a Patrick and Catherine Kavanagh Fellowship, Paul teaches creative writing here at UCD. Do you want to come up, Paul? Thanks. Our next guest could simply walk out onto the stage and you would all know who she is. Multi-award-winning author, Canadian Margaret Atwood is simply one of the world's most accomplished and distinguished authors, and perhaps the most famous. And we are gratified, thrilled, and honored that she is generous enough to agree to join us here at UCD. Please welcome Margaret Atwood to the stage.
It's my great pleasure to fill in for Frank McGuinness, and I'm delighted to ask some questions about adaptation, which Jane has mentioned. Margaret, we might start with you, and we can come back to the last September. There is a novel, Alias Grace, with an Irish character, and with two Irish characters. Yes, but Grace Marks herself is perhaps the protagonist, who is Irish, who hails from Northern Ireland. Perhaps you could speak to us a little bit about the genesis of that novel before we talk about its adaptation. It goes back a long way. There are poems, but there's also Susanna Moodie.
Yes. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, I was in graduate school at Harvard. And this was such a long time ago that women were not allowed into the Lamont Library, where all the modern poetry was. So I couldn't go in there. You could order up a book from it if you knew what book you wanted to order up. Same as for the prohibited X material. But I could get into the stacks at Widener. So I used to go down into the stacks in the Widener Library, and there was a little section of Canadian literature that somebody had obviously been collecting, and then they had died because it just broke off. And beside it was the section on witchcraft and demonology, very conveniently located. So I used to go down there and read alternately from either one when I was avoiding other things. And then I came across Susanna Moodie, which I had already come across earlier in my life. It was in our house, but I never read it because it looked boring. It had, the Canadian wilderness in it. I knew about that. I wanted to read about castles and things like that. But I got into it again, and she wrote two books about Canada. One was called Roughing It in the Bush, and one was called Life in the Clearings. And I started writing poems about her. I actually dreamt that I'd written an opera about her in which there was only one person. And since I can't write music, this was unlikely. But I did start with the poems. And in Life in the Clearings, I found the story of Grace Marks, as written by Susanna Moodie. This was a double murder that took place in 1843, in which a landowner and remittance man called Thomas Kinnear was found in the cellar, not alive, along with his housekeeper and, as it turned out, his mistress, called Nancy Montgomery, also not alive. And the manservant and the barely 16-year-old maidservant had run away to the United States, as one did, on a paddle wheel steamer. The people coming for dinner, Sunday dinner, came and found there was no dinner, and discovered the bodies and pursued them, caught them in Lewistown, brought them back, and they were both tried for the murder of Thomas Kinnear, and they were both convicted. He is the actual murderer, she is an accessory, and they were both condemned to hang. However, some gentlemen got up a petition on her behalf, and her sentence was commuted to life in the penitentiary. And just before he was hanged, the trial for the murder of Nancy Montgomery had never taken place. That murder was never tried. Just before he was hanged, McDermott said, "Grace Marks helped me to strangle Nancy Montgomery. Goodbye, world." So there were 4 people in the house. 2 of them were murdered. The third was hanged, and the only one left was Grace Marks. Opinion was divided, as it often is when there's a man and a woman involved in a crime. He always done it, but she was either the instigator and malevolent, person who manipulated it all, or else she was an innocent victim, and divided this way politically because the reformers took the innocent view and the conservatives took the view that to murder one's conservative employer was bad form. So she was guilty as far as they were concerned. And nobody ever knew. She never told. After the book was published, her leavings questions were discovered in the Kingston Penitentiary archive somewhere. And I got them, and I thought, this is it, the jig's up, she's going to tell, my novel is going to be demolished. But that didn't happen. The leavings questions were like a market research questionnaire. So, how was the food? Great. Where's the door? It went down like this, and finally it said, to what do you attribute your incarceration in this institution? In other words, why were you in the penitentiary? And she didn't say, I'm innocent. She didn't say, because I murdered somebody. She said, through having been employed in the same household as a villain, which is entirely true. I'm sure if there hadn't been two of them, nothing would have happened. But she also doesn't say who the villain was. It might have been the employer.
It might have been. I mean, this is a story, a true story, which stayed with you over the years. The poems, yes?
Yes, I adapted it into a television play in the early 70s when everything was black and white. And I based it on the Susanna Moody version of events. And then I wrote a play about it, but it was a bad play. So that went no further. I didn't want to take it any further. I had some idea of Susanna Moody being flown in on a wire, but it's just as well that didn't happen. And then I forgot about it. And then years later, I was in Zurich. How suggestive. Home of Jung. And I started writing essentially what is the first chapter of that book, and I thought Grace Marks was displeased with my previous version. So I went back and looked up the documents, which I hadn't done before, anything I could find, and found that Susanna Moody had made quite a few mistakes. She got the place wrong, she got the names of the people wrong, she got quite a few things wrong, and it was, in her view, Grace Marks was the instigator, but she always liked to put women at the center of the story. So if Grace Marks was not going to be the instigator, she couldn't be the main character in Susanna Moody's rendition. So then I started and I tried really hard to find out whether she had done it or not, and I couldn't find out. There were too many versions, and too many versions that were questionable. I also had to find out how old the murdered man was. We knew where he was buried, but there was no tombstone. Those had been taken down because they were made of wood, and the church fathers thought they were untidy. So we know where he is, but we don't know. That's all we knew. There was a different Thomas Kinnear, who would have been about 75, and nothing against 75-year-old men, but it probably wouldn't have been the steamy ménage à quatre that it appears to have been at that age. Maybe not. So a friend of mine in Scotland located the real one. He was 43. And his half-brother Charles had evidently wanted to get rid of him and had packed him off to the colonies, and later recorded in Burke's Peerage that the year of Thomas's death was actually the year in which he emigrated to Canada. So Charles wanted to cover up the murder of his brother. It was very disreputable to be murdered.
And your own opinion as to Grace's guilt has changed over the years?
No, I cannot give you any firm answer about that, because there isn't one. And of course I had that nightmare that novelists basing their novels on real things have, which is that somebody will write me a letter and it will say, I went up to the attic and I found a tin biscuit box. And in the tin biscuit box, there were all these letters from my great-great-great-great-grandmother, who was Grace Marks, and you got everything wrong. That hasn't happened.
So there is a great deal of ambiguity over the status of her innocence or guilt. We might talk about how that ambiguity is manifested in the Netflix version and the adaptation. But maybe first I'll go back to the last September and John Banville's adaptation. You talked with such reverence, with such love of Elizabeth Bowen, and it must have been very difficult then to adapt and to make selective omissions and changes for the kind of, I suppose, the visual grammar that film demands. I wonder how challenging that process was.
Not challenging at all, because you cannot approach a book that you're going to adapt for the screen with reverence. You're going to turn it into a vulgar form. Vulgar in the best sense of the word. It's going to be this colored dream that's going to run across the screen. Well, in those days it was. People went to cinemas still. And they'll sit there for 2 hours and be lost in this dream. You can't, it's an entirely different form of language. I remember when I adapted one of my own books for the screen, I realized that every line of dialogue had to be damped down, because in a book, the line of dialogue, it's just a line of words on the page. On the screen, it's literally fleshed out. There is a real human being. Well, if you consider actors real human beings, but anyway, there is let's say a flesh and blood human being who will flesh it out. So you have to. There's no point in, as I say, being reverential. It has to be vulgarized in the best way.
Are you talking about, when you say you're adapting your own work, were you talking about the Newton letter or the sea?
Oh, okay. Any of them. Doesn't matter. The nice thing about doing film scripts is that you don't have to write the difficult bits in between the dialogue. You don't have to write those paragraphs. You could just say, he walks into the room. She says, "Oh, darling," he kisses her. It's wonderful.
Famously...
Look, I'll tell you a story. You asked me about the Newton letter, which was the first thing I adapted. It was this will tell you how long ago it was. It was the days before Channel 4 existed. And Channel 4 people were going about the world looking for likely people to write stuff for them. In fact, there was a famous Mark Boxer cartoon of two people talking at a cocktail party, and one is saying to the other, "Do you know, I met somebody today who isn't doing something for Channel 4? So they came to me and said, "Would you like to adapt this?" It's a very short novel. It's only about 80 pages. My agent, when I sent it to him, had said, "I'm not even going to send this to your publisher because it just won't get published." No. So I thought, well, I'll do something with it. And to adapt it for the screen was wonderful. It took me 2.5 years to write the book. It took me 3 days to write the film script.
Whoa.
I think your expression was money for jam.
Well, it's not money for... I'm sure that's what I said. God, of course, everything...
Apologies for bringing...
Everything is on the bloody internet nowadays. Everything.
Not everything.
Oh, it's not money for jam. It was... In a way, it's... You see, people imagine that... that time is money. That, if you work for 3 years, you must be paid 3 years. And if you work for 3 days, you should be paid only for 3 days. It's not the intensity of writing for those 3 days was almost the same as writing, for 3 years, doing the book itself. But I was delighted to be doing it. I loved script writing. I'll tell you what I'd love to have been. I'd love to have been one of those hacks in the 1940s when they made those beautiful B-movies, black and white, or as I always say, soot and silver. Wonderful, with these exquisitely beautiful people like Joel McRae and Veronica Lake, exquisitely beautiful people. And they made masterpieces, and they would do them in a few weeks for a few $1,000s. And I'd like to have been one of those hacks in an unair-conditioned cabin up in the Hollywood Hills. And the producer comes in at noon and says, listen, kid, you're going to have 3 scenes by 6 o'clock, and they better be good or you're out of the picture, right? I'd love to have been one of those. Banging away on that tractor of a typewriter. You know?
And Margaret, I get the impression that you've actually fulfilled that role as producer, supervisory producer, consultative producer on Alias Grace. Yeah, and there are significant changes to, for example, the doctor's role from the novel to the serialization. Did you approve those changes?
Okay, first of all, the author doesn't get approval. Forget that. Never happens. Because most authors hate the adaptation of their work. And if they could, they would take the money and then they would say, I'm sorry, I don't like the necktie, we're canceling the whole thing. That's what they would, just out of spite, they would do that. I did my first adaptation in 1970-71 of my first novel called The Edible Woman. I did it myself. And here's how it came about. I was living in Edmonton, Alberta. Do you know where that is?
I do.
Yeah. It was even more like what you might think than. So there I was, and I was living in half of a house, sort of the top half, and I was replacing a toilet seat when the phone rang. I'm good with a screwdriver. Being Canadian, I'm good with a screwdriver. The phone rang, and it was long distance from London, or so it purported. This little voice said, "This is Oscar Lowenstein. I'm a film producer. I'm calling from London." And I said, "Who is this really?" But it really was Oscar Lowenstein. And he claimed that he wanted to make a film of the edible woman, and he wanted me to write the script. And I said, "I've never written a script before." He said, "We'll help you." And I said, "Well, I think you should get a real Hollywood script writer." He said, "We don't want one of those broken down hacks, like the kind you wanted to be." So we want something.
We want somebody we can turn into a broken down hack.
Yes, yeah. No, we want somebody that's going to be actually quite cheap. Is what they wanted. So the first person he came up with for me to work with was a young Hungarian director, because his co-producer was a man called John Banville, who later went on to make a film called Quest for Fire, which has become a cult classic. It's the one with the elephant covered with fur purporting to be a mammoth. You may remember it. Nobody has any clothes on. Yeah, so that's probably one of the reasons it became a cult classic. But he hadn't made that yet. So I worked with the Hungarian director, and our script meetings would go like this. He would say, "Margaret, I had a dream last night. We must put my dream into film." And then he would say, "We must cover a naked woman with cellophane, because I've never seen a naked woman covered with cellophane before in a film." So I produced a very purple, sort of lurid rendition of my own novel. But that didn't work out, and Oscar made some sort of a put deal with John Banville and got the project and came out with a different director. And the different director was Tony Richardson of Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner and Tom Jones, etc. And he had quite a different idea of what the movie should be. So his idea was much more like zany movies of the end of the 60s, sort of Malcolm and things like that. So we would foregather in his hill village that he had bought, which was above Saint-Tropez. Yes, and he had, I said, "What happened to the previous inhabitants of this village?" And he said, "They intermurdered each other." So he would say, "This is what I want in the scene," and I would go off and write it and bring it back, and he would say, "Well, this is good, but we need something else here." And we would just, it was like making large cake of some kind. And the thing that came out was completely different from the Hungarian one. And this is what happens with script writing, because the script writer is actually the lowest person on the totem pole, and everybody else then gets their spoon in the mix and wants to add this and take away that, and the actor doesn't like the line, so they have to go and something else has to be written for them. And that's why I don't write scripts anymore. But it was fun at the time. It's a group activity. It's like summer camp for grown-ups. So when the sun is shining and you like the people, it's great. And when it's raining all the time and you hate the people, it's hell. It's like that.
And John, when you were, just to go back to the last September, I mean, you talked so fondly about the novel. There was one very significant decision you made in the writing of the screenplay, which is that iconic fire at the end of the novel. You decided, no, it's not going in the screenplay. And was that an easy decision to come to? Because it seems so final in the novel.
Well, we couldn't have afforded it. Like most films, it was made on a shoestring. And I remember, one of the things about movies is that everything is fake. Everything is fake. When you see people getting out into pouring rain in a movie, it's not rain. Because real rain doesn't look convincing on screen. It's the local fire brigade. And we had to get the local fire brigade to do that earlier film, Reflections. And unfortunately, the director got them on a Sunday, so they had to be paid triple time. They were delighted with themselves, because it was a sunny day and they were pouring rain over. But in the last September, there is a scene which is supposed to be taking place on a perfect day when they're all playing tennis, and it bloody rained. And you can see the rain. And it's not supposed to be there. And I said to the director, I said, what are we going to do? He said, we haven't got the money to film it again. We just have to leave it there and hope they don't notice the rain. So one of the things I love about the movies, everything is fake. And it's the cameraman who makes it look real. And it's our suspension of disbelief, it's our denial of disbelief that makes it real. It is a magical process. As I say, it is a vulgar and, as Margaret says at times, it's a very painful process. But if you were to, the last thing I say is that if you were to expect that your book is going to be filmed, you would be very, very disappointed.
You use the expression there, John, something that's not supposed to be there. And Margaret, in The Handmaid's Tale and in its most recent Hulu incarnation, you've reiterated over the years that nothing in The Handmaid's Tale is in there that has not taken place at some stage in history over the years.
Yeah, there had to be a precedent. In other words, you couldn't just put in a dragon, much though I would have liked that. That wasn't the axiom that we were going on. And the only reason I did that in the book as well is that I didn't want people saying you have a twisted, evil imagination and none of this isn't how human beings behave. So I wanted to be able to say, well, actually they do, and here is when they did. And the series actually is following that rule. They are doing their research.
And you would have read say, George Orwell's 1984 as a young person. You found yourself in Berlin in 1984.
Wasn't that corny? Yes, I couldn't help it.
Well, coincidence, shall we say, or a beautiful coincidence. But this then meant that the novel was published, I suppose, in the wake of political division.
Oh, you mean the series came out in the wake of a political?
Well, I mean, I suppose the genesis of the novel, having been born the year of the start of the war, then having having traveled to Berlin and seen the kind of political division there,
Oh, I see.
maybe that informed...
You mean the wall was still there?
Was still
yes,
there,
it was,
yes.
and I visited East Berlin, and
Yes.
I visited Czechoslovakia and also Poland. And previously, we had been to Iran 8 months before the Shah went down, and to Afghanistan 6 weeks before Daoud was assassinated. So we saw those societies in operation at that time. So all of this feeds in, as do the totalitarianisms of the 20th century, which are numerous, and their behavior is quite similar in a lot of respects.
And the prescience of that novel and the series we saw on the streets of Dublin even last September with the protests against the Eighth Amendment, to repeal the Eighth Amendment, with protesters dressed up as handmaids. And I believe you followed that online, or you certainly knew about it.
Certainly, and it wasn't the only place. And I think the reason that has happened in a lot of countries is that you can put on the outfit, which is pretty iconic by now, and you're not going to get kicked out of a legislature, for instance, because you're not making a disturbance. You're not jumping up and down, you're not shouting, you're just sitting very modestly and saying nothing. And it is a situation in which silence speaks louder than words. So people know what it means. And it's not just one issue, it's across the board, because what you would have to do if you wanted to stuff women back into the home, which was what people were saying in 1984 that they wanted to do, you would just reverse a number of laws that have been enacted since, say, about 1850, and you would deprive women of the rights that they have now. And I threw in a few extras, such as the right to read. That causes so much trouble. But, you know, to own property, to have a job, to control your own money, all of these are rights that have been acquired. And if you reverse them, women would have no place to be but the home.
Indeed. And there's a...
This is not a blueprint.
Or an instruction manual. What were some of the placards in the US were make Margaret Atwood fiction again. Something like that, right?
Yeah, there were quite a few different ones.
There were quite a few. Just to mention your kind of multifaceted role in these adaptations, consultative producer, and then for anybody who's seen the first episode of *Handmaid's Tale*, there's a very surprising, dare I say, frightening cameo. Was that?
Yes,
Was that your idea?
Yes. No, it wasn't my idea exactly, but I did agree to do it. So yes, I whack Elizabeth Moss over the head, and we had to shoot that 4 times because apparently I wasn't doing it vigorously enough. And they added in, as you say, everything's fake. They added in an extra sound effect to make it seem like an even more severe wallop. But it is a surreal moment when your leading lady is turning around and saying, "Hit me harder." Yes. I also have a cameo in Alias Grace, which is called Disapproving Woman. And I actually had a trailer with Disapproving Woman on a sign on it. And I was very disapproving because it was 90 degrees and I had to put on the full Victorian outfit, which has about 5 layers. And I said to them, why do I have to put on all this, you know, on the bottom half? Because you're only going to see the top. And they said, we want you to feel authentic. I also have a cameo as an owl in, never mind.
Just making the segues more and more difficult. I'll keep on trucking. John, it was, we mentioned the Newton letter, but it was adapted into Reflections. It's a beautifully quiet film with Donal McCann and Gabriel Byrne, and Fionnuala Flanagan.
And Harriet Walter.
And Harriet.
But do you have a cameo?
No.
No?
Afraid no.
Come on.
But I'll tell you what, when I went, they took me in to see Gabriel Byrne's wardrobe, the clothes he was going to wear. And I looked at them and I said to the director, these are all, I wear clothes like this. He said, yeah, you're him, aren't you? And I said, no, I'm not him. I said, he's a broken down historian, a dried up academic. He's just generally awful. The director said, yeah? It's a merciless world.
You got to work with Gabriel Byrne again with a much later adaptation of your Benjamin Black novels.
No, I didn't do anything of that. I had nothing to do with that at all.
But he does appear in those.
Oh, he does appear, but I didn't write the script or have any role in the.
No role in that. No. Even though interestingly,
they didn't want me, the bastards.
They didn't want you. But interestingly enough, the genesis of those novels was a kind of truncated screenplay. Is that right?
Oh yes, I was. This is the vagaries of the screenwriting life. I was commissioned by RTE Television here and ABC Television in Australia to write a series about, very prescient series about babies being taken from mothers and sent to Australia. And I wrote it. It was a three-hour miniseries. And of course it didn't get made, like most screenplays. And I hate to waste anything. So I decided one day that I would turn it into a novel. And then the novel got turned back into a screenplay.
Yeah, there's wonderful circularity there.
Yeah.
But there's other ways of thinking about adaptation as well. Margaret, you've written a version of Shakespeare's The Tempest, and John, you've written some Henry James. So maybe you would talk about those adaptations, not into screen, but into another more contemporary idiom.
What is the Henry James one?
Oh, I wrote a book called Mrs. Osmond. You wouldn't have heard of it. It was published recently. Recently.
But I have now.
It's a sequel. It's a direct sequel to The Portrait of a Lady.
Yeah. I would like to read that. That's my favorite Henry James book.
Would you describe that as was that an act of ventriloquism, or were you, or was it something else?
Well, first of all, it was an act of homage to the greatest novelist. I think Henry James is the greatest. He himself recognized that The Portrait of a Lady wasn't finished. Maybe it's better that way. But at least twice in his notebooks, he toys with the idea of writing the second part. But he says, I have more things to do now. So I decided to do it for him. And I enjoyed it immensely. It's so much easier to write where you can put on a mask, you're not yourself. I wrote a lot of it when I was teaching at the University of Chicago. And there were days when I would sit back and watch my hand writing as if it were someone else's. It was wonderful, wonderful experience. And I would use words that I wasn't quite sure the meaning of, and then I would look them up and I would find that they were the right words. So I'm not in any way mystical, but Henry was somewhere about. Now, whether he liked the end product or not, I don't know. Perhaps I'll be struck down one day by a fountain pen. But it's not the same as adaptation. It's of course, it's pastiche. I took all the characters of The Portrait of a Lady and moved them on a few months. Adapting something for the screen is an entirely different process. as I said a while ago, it's the medium of a novel and the medium of screen are completely different. You have to write completely different ways for them. You have to be, when you're writing for the screen, you have to be humble. You have to realize that the actors, the director, the cinematographer, the people who make the tea, the people who do the makeup, they're going to be the ones that will produce this thing, for good or ill. We know which one it usually is. But you know, there's no point in chasing after them. Scott Fitzgerald complained about, he did his screenplay and only one line got onto the screen. I thought, you got one line on the screen. Lucky for you, Scott.
But that notion of authorship and identity is very interesting, and shifting identities, because you do write under a pseudonym. And Margaret, just to go back to Alias Grace, there's this, there's this really interesting sense of identity that Grace Marks has with her friend, Mary Whitney, isn't that right?
Yes, that was one of her aliases.
It was one of her aliases, and I suppose there's a grey area there over whether Grace was her or she was Grace, or whether they were one and the same person. I mean, that kind of multiple sense of identity or authorial control interests you, I believe.
A lot. But when you think of a character in a book, how do we know about that person? So we know about them through what they say, what they do, what other people say about them, what other people do in relation to them. Those are some of the ways we know about those people. So if a person has one idea of him or herself and somebody else has quite a different idea, which is the real one? Just for instance. Or is there a real? 19th century was an age, because it's a period piece, it was an age in which people were fascinated by the idea of the self. And where was the self when you were asleep? Where was the self when you were hypnotized? The first multiple personality case appears in 1819. And how many operas are there written about somnambulism in the 19th century? I think at least 5. So they were, all of this was pre-Freudian.
Yes.
And people were just fascinated by it. It was also the age of mesmerism and hypnotism, medical clairvoyance. Spiritualism appears in the middle of the century, brought in by 2 sisters from Belleville, Ontario, another claim to fame on behalf of Canada.
I'm getting a nod from Jane. I think we have to wrap up soon, very soon now.
Yes, we would like to thank you both for this marvelous conversation. Thank you all for that wonderful conversation, and sorry to cut it short. However, we have very, very, very important business to attend to. We have come here tonight not just to celebrate the literary connections between Ireland and Canada as they have manifested themselves over the years, but to forge a permanent and ongoing connection between the worlds of Irish and Canadian letters. As the ultimate goal of literature is universality, the best way, to my mind, for Canada and Ireland to cement the universality of both their literatures is to present the Ulysses Medal, UCD's highest honor, to that most universal of contemporary authors, Margaret Atwood. Thank you. It has also, excuse me, it has also occurred to me that hidden forces must have been at work when, as James Joyce himself would have it, snow was general all over Ireland on March 1st of this year, thereby ensuring that the March date for this event would have to be canceled and that this presentation we are making tonight would therefore take place after, rather than before, the heartwarming, resounding yes of the referendum to appeal the Eighth Amendment of the Irish Constitution. Because what could be more Margaret Atwood than that resounding yes in favor of women's rights? It is my belief, in fact, that most of the strides forward that have taken place in recent decades in relation to women's rights have been made easier by the enormous fact of Margaret Atwood's brilliant and hugely influential books. Millions of men and women all over the world have read them, have been delighted and sometimes horrified by them, have been shaken out of their comfort level by them, and have had their minds enlarged and their lives enhanced by them. Survival, Oryx and Crake, Morning in the Burned House, Wilderness Tips, Alias Grace, The Blind Assassin, Angel Catbird, Payback, Princess Prunella, and The Purple Peanut, The Handmaid's Tale. Casually listing only a few of the titles from her prodigious and award-winning output covers the full range of literary expression: novels, short stories, literary criticism, poetry, social commentary, children's literature, science fiction, graphic novels, and mysteries. And not infrequently, a single text will run the full length of all these genres. But let me be clear, Margaret Atwood is not the kind of author who hides in her study creating deathless works of art, never venturing, which she does, of course, create deathless works of art, but the kind of author that never ventures into the full light of the sometimes messy reality of the social and political world. Yes, she does create timeless literature. Look at what has happened just this year with Handmaid's Tale and Alias Grace, both published over 2 decades ago. But she is not only fearless in her work, as one must be to create true literature, but in her life. She has given her time, her support, her unmistakable voice to so many important causes over the years, it would take hours and hours to list even half of them. She has taken on environmental issues, social problems, women's struggles, and multiple injustices. She is often prescient in her concerns. Some of those injustices have been fully ignored until after she has brought them to our attention. And her point of view is not always the most popular, at least in the beginning. But her belief in the human spirit is unshakable. And as if knowing this, the collective will almost always eventually sees that what she has been trying to show them. There is a fierce, stubborn integrity at Margaret Atwood's core, both in her work and in her life, and there is kindness. Margaret Atwood is above all a humanitarian. I would therefore like to ask Margaret Atwood to return to the stage, and I call upon UCD President Professor Andrew J. Deeks to present the UCD Ulysses Medal, the university's highest honor, to the great Margaret Atwood.
Margaret Atwood. By the authority vested in me by the university, I hereby present you with the Ulysses Medal. Congratulations.
Thank you. This is extremely handsome and has a beautiful Ulysses boat on one side, just for instance. I'm deeply honored to be receiving this medal today. I was supposed to be receiving it in early March, but Jane Urquhart's planned Canada Fest was a little too successful in bringing Canada to Ireland. And although Dublin experienced the delights of snowballs, no planes were flying. But here I am now and happy to be talking about Ulysses in two forms, Joyce's Ulysses and the original. Joyce's Ulysses was a must-read book when I was at university in the late 1950s. It had just been unbanned in 1949 in Canada and still had a whiff of brimstone about it. Greg Gatenby, who ran the International Writers' Festival in Toronto for many years, says that when he was attending a strict boys' Catholic school in the 60s, the teacher said, "There is a wicked, wicked, wicked book that you must never, ever read, as it is deeply sinful, Ulysses by James Joyce." So, of course, Greg rushed out to read it, hoping to wallow in the dirty parts. Instead, he was enthralled by the language and the characters and thus was converted to a lifelong devotion to literary fiction. I must have had a similar experience with Ulysses because I find myself referring to it in a speech I gave in 1982 called Writing the Male Character. I was distinguishing between male figures in romances and those in more realistic novels, and using Leopold Bloom as a touchstone for realism, as well as the prime example of a male character with warts and all. I said this: a careful study of Wuthering Heights will reveal that Heathcliff is never to be observed picking his nose or even blowing it. And you can search through Walter Scott in vain for any mention of bathrooms. Leopold Bloom, on the other hand, is preoccupied with the mundane wants of the body on almost every page. And we find him sympathetic, yes, and comic and also pathetic, but he is not exactly love's young dream. Leopold Bloom climbing in through Kathy's window would probably slip. Serious novelists in the 20th century usually opt for Leopold, and poor Heathcliff has been relegated to the Gothic romance. If a novelist is female, she too will probably go for Leopold with all his habits, daydreams, and wants. This doesn't mean that she hates men, merely that she's interested in what they look like without the cloak. It is hard to overestimate the extent to which Ulysses moved the needle in the direction of warts. That's why it was so widely banned. Not since King Lear and Chaucer before him had anyone called attention to the essential human, poor, bare, naked, and forked, and not incidentally smelly. It was unseemly. The literary space in which things could be said about bodies, so narrowed in the 19th century, had been vastly enlarged by James Joyce. My second encounter with Ulysses, the mythical character Joyce used as an organizing principle for his tour de force, came by way of a novel I myself was writing as part of the Canongate Myths series. Take any myth, went the mandate, and write a 50,000-word novel based on it. Having failed to produce anything on the subject of Mouse Woman, no, you don't know who that is, and this was the problem, I found myself telling the story of Penelope narrated by herself from the underworld, with a chorus of the 12 maids, Ulysses and Telemachus, hanged after all the suitors were slain. Joyce doesn't put that part in. On the way through the writing of this book, I found myself meditating on the two patron gods of Odysseus. They are Athene, who admires Odysseus because he is such a liar and contriver of tricks, and Hermes, the god of jokes, thieves, artifice, travelers, and wanderers, crossroads, and communication. He is also the revealer of secrets and the opener of doors, and the one God who, being the conductor of souls to the underworld, can freely come and go between the world of life and the world of death. If you want classical order and balance, Apollo is your god of art. But if instead you want those other qualities I have just named, Hermes is the one for you. He was also, it seems clear to me, the one for James Joyce, and must have opened doors for him, revealed secrets to him, facilitated his wanderings, helped with the jokes and puns, and conducted him to and from the underworld all his life. So thank you, University of Dublin, for this wonderful honor. Thank you, James Joyce, for the many gifts you gave all of us. As for Hermes, patron of writers and opener of doors, I will sacrifice an egg to you the next time I am at a crossroads. My thanks to all.
So this concludes our evening of Imagining Home. I hope you found it half as thrilling as I've found it. I would just like to say once again to thank you to the authors, Margaret, John, Anne, Paul, and of course Jane URQUHART, who has been an amazing person to have with us at UCD this year. So thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.